Protect your DNA. BioPQQ can promote formation of new mitochondria. Infowarsstore.com.
Earlier today, I interviewed someone from the Free State Project in New Hampshire because, we have a lot of people who follow us and they understand the fraud, the manipulation that's inherent in our electoral system, just as we were talking to Bev Harris earlier today with black box voting about the many different ways that the system is gamed. So what do we do about that? Well, it turns out there's a lot of different ways you can get involved, and we're going to talk about that at the end of this segment. We're going to play that interview that's with a state representative in New Hampshire. And of course, in New Hampshire, they came up with the idea that they would try to get a critical mass in a small state of about 20,000 people. They're nearly there. They've got a little over 16,000 now. Or looking at it from a different perspective, if we had the same ratio, there would be 99,000 congressmen in the U.S. Congress if we had that kind of representation. So we don't have much representation at the federal level. That's part of the problem. And in New Hampshire, they've got a smaller state. They've got more direct local control there. And of course, people have also gotten involved there in terms of direct action. And Keene is a big example of that. We're going to be talking to the state representative. We'll have that interview at the end of the segment. But I wanted to, before we get to that, talk about some amendments that were on the ballot in various states today and how they turned out. In North Carolina, there was a constitutional amendment that would waive the right to trial by jury for felony charges. Now, this is something that would allow the person who is being charged with a felony to voluntarily waive that right. It was demanded by the North Carolina Constitution. They said, we need to get this out of the way because we need to streamline the justice system. The problem is that, of course, they're going to use pressure in terms of plea bargaining, as we've seen. We've essentially seen trial by jury evaporate throughout the United States because of this kind of plea bargaining pressure where they trump up the charges against someone and then say, if you will plead guilty to these lesser charges, we'll take off these other phony charges. That's what's going to happen. People are going to lose their right to a trial by jury. Of course, they're not exercising that right in most cases. And in many cases, it doesn't work because the jurors are not fully informed of what their duty is. But it's sad to see that fail in North Carolina. 54% of the people said they didn't value their right to a trial by jury. That's a sad state of affairs. A little bit better in Tennessee. Now, in Tennessee, they do not have a state income tax, but several times in recent history, they've tried to impose that on the people of Tennessee. So they put a ballot measure there to say that there will never be an income or payroll tax, and that won 66 to 33%. In Florida, the medical marijuana initiative failed. It became very close. It was just under 60%. They needed 60% to make that pass. The interesting thing about this, I think, is that when this first qualified for the ballot this summer, it had 90% support in the public. Now, they got behind that and opposed it. It was Sheldon Adelson was the person who was most involved in that, providing 85% of the funding. Sheldon Adelson, if you don't know, is a casino owner in Las Vegas, very big in the gambling industry. He was someone who was instrumental in the primary in the 2012 caucuses there in Las Vegas. He famously got a caucus set up for a Sunday that was originally scheduled for a Saturday night, and he got it set up for a Sunday and tried to enforce that only Orthodox Jews would be allowed to vote in that process. And he is someone who gave millions to the campaign of Newt Gingrich, essentially a one-man super PAC for Newt Gingrich. He gave $15,000 to Lindsey Graham, and immediately Lindsey Graham introduced an online gaming ban. Of course, I'm sure that was just a coincidence, but here you have a situation where he can give $15,000 to Lindsey Graham when Dinesh D'Souza talks to some friends and raises $20,000 because he didn't follow the letter of the law. He didn't just get a civil penalty. He got a criminal penalty. They're going to send him to jail for that. But of course, Sheldon Adelson can give millions to Newt Gingrich. He can give $15,000 to Lindsey Graham, and he can give $4 million to stop medical marijuana in Florida, and he did. He got what he wanted. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the no people were saying that medical marijuana was going to be an excuse for outright legalization, and so it had to be stopped. Where was Sheldon Adelson on the legalization initiatives in the District of Columbia, in Oregon, in Alaska? not a dime for those. So basically what he did was, even though they're saying we can't have medical marijuana, we can't allow the compassionate treatment for people who are suffering under cancer therapy, under HIV therapy, under many different issues. It even is very beneficial for glaucoma. We will not allow that for medical purposes. We will send people to jail, saying that they don't want to see this turn into a legalization thing, and yet he doesn't support a ban on legalization in these other states. So what is the issue there? Well, Vice magazine looked at it, as reported earlier. They said he has tried several times to get into the casino business in Florida, which currently is controlled by the Seminole tribe, the Indian tribe there in Florida. So perhaps that's part of the move. I don't know. Nevertheless, it is sad to see that that option taken off the table for people in Florida. Now, in other news, we see that, and we're going to talk about people in New Hampshire, libertarians who are standing up for their rights, basically standing up to parking meter maids, paying off people's parking as their parking meter expires, putting money in the meter so they don't get a ticket. That's a very visible example of standing up for fellow citizens, and I think it's something that's really helped them in the public light. It's something that's not a big fine, but it's a nuisance fine for people. They did, in fact, cost the city $80,000, and the city got quite irate about it. But there are other ways to engage in civil disobedience. And we've reported on this before. Pulpit Freedom Sunday is a thing that happens once a year by an organization, the Alliance Defending Freedom. And this year, they did it again, and they endorsed candidates from the pulpit. This is one way that the IRS has intimidated people. You know, it's not just going after the Tea Party. For decades, the IRS has been intimidating pastors from talking about politics or moral issues from the pulpit in a way that would get involved in politics. Now, this is something that, the original Tea Party, I could say, was the Black Regiment of the American Revolution. It was the pastors who galvanized their congregation about issues like religious freedom and free speech and things that really set afire the 1776 revolution. But of course, they stopped all this using the IRS to intimidate people with an amendment that was passed by Lyndon Johnson. That is in direct conflict with the First Amendment. And so the Alliance Defending Freedom has taken the idea that they're going to directly challenge this. So for several years now, they've had thousands of pastors make explicit endorsements from the pulpit on a specific Sunday and then tape that and send it to the IRS, defying them to do something about it. And like we see in so many different instances, like we saw with John Corbett standing up to the TSA, like we saw with the fellow in Michigan, Baker's Green Acres, who stood up to the Department of Natural Resources there in Michigan, who said that he could not raise a certain type of pig. It costs people a lot to stand up to that, but eventually, if you persist at it, if they don't drive you out of business, if they don't totally bankrupt you, they will eventually ignore you and leave you alone. And that's what they're doing now with the pastors there. They have yet to come back to any of the pastors and say that they're going to take away their tax exemption, which, of course, is the sword of Damocles that they hang over their heads. Now, last election in 2012 in North Carolina, there was a constitutional amendment passed to ban same-sex marriage. That year, I think it was 5 states had that issue before them. 3 of them accepted same-sex marriage. 2 of them rejected it. North Carolina was one of those to reject it. What has happened this year, just within the last month or so, a North Carolina judge had rejected that constitutional amendment, said that it was unconstitutional according to the U.S. Constitution. It went to the U.S. Supreme Court. They refused to hear it, so it stands. Now, the fallout of that, I think, brings up an interesting point, and that is the conflict of rights. We've seen that the Libertarian Party in most instances has come down on the side of same-sex marriage, saying that that's a civil liberties issue. But when they force people to recognize it, or in this case, when they force magistrates or they force pastors to marry people, I think at that point, they are infringing on someone else's rights. Certainly no one is suggesting anywhere that I know of that homosexual people would not be allowed to live together, to do whatever they wish, but there are a lot of people who don't want to be compelled to participate in their wedding, to marry them, to take photographs or whatever, and we see over and over again in different places that now that is turning into a coercive measure against people violating their religious freedom. And so we see that some North Carolina judges have now resigned rather than perform these marriages because they say that conflicts with their religious freedom. It brings up an interesting conflict of rights. And this organization that has organized Pulpit Freedom Sunday is telling them, you don't have to resign. You can stand on your First Amendment rights. So I think this is going to make an interesting case of a conflict of rights. We have seen that in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, a couple who had a marriage chapel there, and they were also, I think, ministers in some church there, said that they did not want to perform same-sex marriages. They are now have the municipality coming after them, threatening them with several months in jail and thousands of dollars in fines. So that is now going into a legal court case there. So it's not a clear case that if you have a ballot amendment that gets passed, that you're not going to have that struck down by a court judge. We've seen the same thing happen in New Hampshire with the fully informed jury law that was passed there by the legislature, saying that the judge would not, could not take punitive measures against a lawyer who argued for jury nullification and could not prohibit a defendant from making that argument. That has now been struck down by a judge, so there's still work to do there. But as we see, there's many ways that you can approach that, and as we're going to see now in this interview in New Hampshire, they're coming at it from an educational standpoint as well. Having people show up at the courthouse when they're picking juries, educating jurors as to what their rights and their responsibilities are as jurors. They have a right and a duty to judge the law as well as the facts of the case. And so if we have people that understand and exercise those rights, understand their duty and exercise that duty, that is what's going to be needed to bring back trial by jury. As we see in North Carolina, they just said, well, I don't think we need that anymore. We can just streamline this case. I don't think so. Without further ado, let's go to that interview we had with Mark Warden in New Hampshire. He's a state representative. He moved there as part of the Free State Project, and we talked to him about working within the system and working outside of the system. You know, there's a lot of ways to game the political system to try to get the results that you want to have happen. We've seen this in the past with gerrymandering. That served the interest of various political parties. We see Obama essentially doing this with open borders and trying to open the voting rolls to people who aren't even citizens, trying to get a reliable block of voters who are going to support his agenda for a more socialist welfare state. What if that were done to serve the cause of freedom? In 2001, a Yale doctorate student, Jason Sorens, came up with the idea for the Free State Project. They wanted to find a state where they could move a lot of people who were interested in liberty, where they could collect together and move that state instead of being diluted amongst the 50 states. New Hampshire was an ideal location because of its small size, because of its small government, and because the legislators there are so responsive, so local to the public, with just a few people per legislator. They're only paid $100 a year in New Hampshire. So it's a more open system to change than we see in many of the larger states. Joining us today is someone who moved to New Hampshire as part of the Free State Project, and he is concerned with constitutional limited government, lower state spending, individual liberty, lower taxes, Second Amendment. Joining us now is Mark Warden, state representative from New Hampshire. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mark. I know it's a busy day today with the election and you're running for re-election. I wanted to focus on a couple of different issues. Number one, the effectiveness of people who are strategically thinking and acting at a local level. And then the other part of that I want to talk to you about in the second part of the interview is what activists are doing in New Hampshire apart from elections. Now, this is, you're coming up to your second term, is that correct?
That's right. I just finished my second term in New Hampshire. We have 2-year terms for the state legislature, and I've been a state rep.
Okay, and I think one of the things that people don't realize so often, they get caught up in the really high-profile races, governor, senator, president. They don't really think about what's happening down ticket where they can have a big effect. with state representatives, with town council people, with sheriffs, for example, who are going to stand up for their liberties. And I think we've seen that happen in New Hampshire. You've got a very unique situation there. I remember about 20 years ago, I was told that if somebody spent more than $1,000 to try to get elected to state legislature, they were accused of buying the election. Is that still true?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Here in New Hampshire, we have the largest state legislature in the country with 400 representatives and 24 senators. So what that means is it's very accessible to the people, and it also means that your legislator is held accountable. Each state rep only represents about 3,000 people across the state. So
Wow.
we have, lowest population districts anywhere. And what it means is people see you at the grocery store, at the coffee shop, they know who you are, they knock on your door, and it really helps to keep people honest and accountable.
That's right. And that's what I think is the power of people looking down ballot, looking at the people who are in their local city government, looking at people who are at the state government. Now, in many places, I think back in North Carolina, it was well over 50,000 people that we had per state representative. So New Hampshire is kind of unique in that respect. Give us a feel for your involvement. You're pretty much on the political side, is that correct, in terms of election as opposed to direct action?
Yeah, that's right. I've done a little bit of both, but I did move out to New Hampshire because of Free State Project, which, as you know, is a sort of a geopolitical movement to get liberty-minded people to move to the small state of New Hampshire, and once here to exert the fullest practical effort to reduce the size of government and expand personal liberty. So some people choose to act in the political realm, as I have done, with success, and whereas others might be more comfortable doing their own type of outreach or activism, whether that's civil disobedience or starting a business or starting homeschooling networks. Everybody has a different path to liberty.
Exactly. And along those lines, we've seen a lot of things done, particularly in Keene, New Hampshire, and the Robin Hood Project. Explain that to the people who are listening.
Sure. There are a number of activists in the small town of Keene, New Hampshire, who started going around putting nickels in parking meters, walking ahead of the meter maid, of the so-called parking enforcement officers, right? So they thought it was kind of a fun thing to do, and really the people that avoided a $10 or $15 ticket loved it. They thought it was great. So these folks were just doing it as volunteers. They put a little note on the windshield saying, "Hey, we saved you from a ticket. If you like what we're doing, please join us. Pay it forward. Do it for somebody else, or send us a check." And really, the townsfolk have loved it. But of course, the town itself, the bureaucrats, hate it.
Yeah. I think that's a genius idea because it really hits people. It's a small amount of money that's involved there, but it really hits people about the predatory nature of government, doesn't it?
That's exactly right. It points out the gun in the room and the real nature of government, which is to grow and to take money from people. So what's interesting about the whole story is the reaction from the city. And they couldn't stand it. So they put an injunction against these guys and took them to court and had a number of hearings. Of course, it all fell through because these people are just doing something as volunteers and acting to help out their neighbors. But boy, the city hated it.
Yeah. They tried to change the kind of parking meters that they had even, didn't they?
Yeah, they tried to change them to, the coinless ticket-based thing. And then, of course, they tried to pass a new ordinance that said you have to be so many feet from a parking enforcement officer and you can't talk to them and things like this.
So they're just illustrating the point. They're just illustrating the point that the Robin Hood people were making about how predatory, how intrusive, how dictatorial these guys are. They could easily just charge people $10 more in taxes or whatever, just put it into property taxes or sales taxes. Or, well, you guys don't have a sales tax there, right?
No state sales tax.
Yeah.
Right. There is on rooms and meals, but no state sales tax, no state income tax, which is another of the reasons that people have chosen New Hampshire to move here with Free State Project, and frankly for all sorts of reasons. New Jersey and New York and California, these places are just doubling down against gun owners. So legal gun owners have one day doing a nice thing, celebrating their Second Amendment, and the next day they're a felon when they change the laws in Massachusetts or New York. So those places are driving people out. They have net out migrations. Then you have freedom-loving states like Montana, Wyoming, and here in New Hampshire that are seeing net immigration of people who value personal freedoms.
Yeah, I've seen other things about Keene where they basically have a network of people somebody gets pulled over in a traffic stop, they'll send out a text message to other people or a phone message, and they'll show up to make sure that everything is being done, or basically kind of point out to the police that it's a victimless crime if they're just breaking the speed limit. So they have a lot of different types of activism like that. Give us an idea of what's going on in the legislative side, because, of course, today is Election Day. What kind of success has the Free State Project had in terms of getting state representatives elected who value liberty?
Yeah, we're making real progress. But first of all, I need to point out, David, that the Free State Project is really not a political group or organization. It does not engage in politics. Its sole mission is to get freedom-loving people to move to New Hampshire. But certainly those people, once here, get involved and do their best they can to affect change by reducing the size of government, reducing the cost and scope of government, protecting our civil liberties. And that's where I've been involved. And as you mentioned, we have had a number of successes. There have been nearly 20 Free State Project participants over the years who have been elected to the state legislature. And we have 20 or more running for office today, and I expect 2/3 of those to win. So basically what you're looking at is a very small percentage of the 400, but it's a group who's super motivated, typically very well educated, intelligent, mobilized, and has a good community and support group behind them. So what we do is we get together in a caucus and form sort of factions inside the legislature, work with other let's say natives and other New Hampshireites who are in the House who also believe in constitutional limits on government. And we've been able to not only stop a lot of bad laws, but pass good laws. One of the biggest milestones was in 2011, passed a budget that reduced state spending by $1 billion. It was a 10 or 11% decrease in state spending. It was historic, largest in the country and the largest in the history of New Hampshire. And a lot of members of the Liberty community who are state reps had a big part to play in that.
Well, you know, you said that you've only got, say, 20 or so, and you hope to see those numbers go up. But because they're hardcore people and because you're starting to build a constituency that is looking at the liberty side of all these different issues, I would imagine you would be able to get people that would not normally have been in that, been looking at the liberty side of issues, people who are Republicans, who are Democrats in the legislature, start to move your way on individual issues. On some of the issues, you'd probably be aligning yourself with Democrats, on other issues with Republicans.
Well, that's exactly right. We like to look at a personal freedom issue like, let's say, marijuana, to grow your own or to smoke marijuana. Nobody should be thrown in a cage for that. So there are some Democrats who agree with that. The libertarian, the free stater type of minority helped stop the repeal of gay marriage. They've helped pass medical marijuana and notably also worked towards getting the jury nullification on the books here in New Hampshire.
Yeah, and that's what I want to talk to you about, because to me, that is kind of a junction between the legislative and the individual activist. Because if you're on a jury, you have the power to use your vote to shut down an unjust law. And people don't understand that they have that power. They've been misinformed by judges. Judges threaten and punish lawyers if they inform the jury of that right. And so in New Hampshire, you guys were able to get a law passed that essentially would not require the judge to tell people that they have, people on a jury, that they have a right to judge the law as well as the facts, but it would keep them from essentially taking action against lawyers who brought up that defense. Is that correct?
Yes, that's great. Isn't that great? I mean,
yes.
It's a real milestone. It's a huge advancement for people who have committed no crime against person or property, where there's no victim. A chance for the juries to see that and just drop the case altogether. There's already been one instance of it where somebody was growing his own marijuana for, I think, religious or personal use purposes, and the jury saw right through that. So it does. What this law says is that the defense attorney or the defendant himself can bring up the idea of jury nullification. The judge can't stop him or her from doing it. But we got to take the next step. So we also have activists out here who stand at the courtroom steps on jury selection day and hand out flyers and pamphlets, helping to educate them about the right to jury nullification.
You know, I interviewed the New Jersey weed man, I guess it was back in 2012, There's a guy who was a medical marijuana patient and a marijuana activist in California. He went to New Jersey, where the laws were much stricter. They had him for a very large quantity of marijuana based on their laws. They were going to send him away for a very long period of time. He reasoned that the majority of people didn't support marijuana laws, so he figured he could get 3 hung juries in a row. The first trial, he put up a sign that showed that in the New Jersey Constitution, it said that jurors had the right to judge the law as well as the facts of the case. The first judge made him take it down, but they'd already seen that. And so they acquitted him 7-5. But then the prosecutor came back a second time. The second time he got a judge that allowed him to leave that up and talk about it. And at that time, he was acquitted 12-0, and they couldn't come back after him again. It was a very important illustration of the power of that. And of course, that's something that goes back hundreds of years in English and American common law, a tradition. It's written in many of our constitutions, and yet we have a judiciary who says just the opposite, misinforming and lying to the juries in most cases.
And unfortunately, a lot of people in the legislatures across the country think the same way.
Yes.
It's sort of a rigged system in that the people who are drawn to politics often are the kind of folks who like government, they like rules and regulation, they want to control others.
Yes.
So this jury nullification is probably the single greatest power that any single individual has. So even though nobody likes the idea of sitting on a jury, we should encourage our freedom-loving folks and your listeners to go out there and sign up and volunteer for jury duty and embrace it when it comes along. Because you could really make the difference in somebody's life.
Yes. Now, I want to do a quick follow-up, and maybe you can fill us in as to what you think the status of this. Just on October 24th, Reason said that the jury nullification law in New Hampshire was just recently gutted by the New Hampshire Supreme Court. Is that your take on what happened with this recent trial?
And no, it was a setback for sure. So we're going to have to come back legislatively and tighten it up a little bit. This always happens whenever you pass a law that's not airtight. You'll find people who are going to exploit it to their own advantage. And, of course, the powers that be, the establishment, don't like anybody be able to beat the system. So they challenge it. I think the important parts are still there, but we'd like to improve it and probably require a judge to give this this disclosure to juries before they even start. I think that'd be the next logical step.
Well, you know, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. You're never going to get there where the other side is going to stop trying to take away your freedoms, your property. So it's a constant fight, isn't it, Mark?
It absolutely is. And this is kind of a funny aside, but after 4 years in the legislature, I found out that no matter how skeptical you are about government, it's worse than that.
Yeah.
I started out as an activist, a libertarian type, and an anti-government, anti-establishment type of person, and I got elected. Even with that message, people elected me. But once I got there, I realized that most people who are drawn to that kind of power, they like it, and they have a good old boys club. And one thing that they don't teach in Civics 101 is that despite the idea or the concept of these checks and balances of the 3 different parts of government, you have the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive branches, the lines are scarily blurred when you look closely.
Yes.
For example, during the legislative hearings, you'd have a long parade of the bureaucrats from the departments, the state departments, and bureaucracies in there telling the legislators how to vote, or how to change the law to benefit them, not to benefit people or to liberty, but the department. So this is something we need to make people aware of, and why it's important that more regular people get involved instead of just throwing up their hands saying there's nothing they can do. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for talking to us. You're a very good example of how people can get some things done at the local level. I understand people's skepticism, but I don't understand the cynicism of just throwing up your hands and saying the system is too corrupt, it's hopeless, we can't do anything. That's exactly what they want you to do. I really appreciate you people at the Free State Project in New Hampshire, and especially you, Mark Warden, for standing up and fighting for liberty up there. Thank you so much. Thank you, David. Good luck today. And again, a good example of why participation in the electoral process, if you do it strategically, can be effective. And of course, New Hampshire is a unique situation. It's why it was picked by the Free State Project. It's a very small
state to start with, and the ratio of people to their representatives is very small. The amount of money that's in play there is very small compared to most states. Nevertheless, you can still do something at the local level. There is still a lot of power that is just sitting there that we could turn towards serving the cause of liberty. Now, stay with us. We're going to be right back for more election updates.
The survival shield and then the male vitality. I'm telling you, for a 50-year-old guy, I am so much leaner now.
We don't need Obamacare. We need to start healing people.
Alex Jones here to share some very exciting information with you. Going back to when I first got on air back in 1995, I quit working out and I went from 180 pounds to 275 pounds. Then I started changing my diet some. I started exercising, swimming, lifting weights, but the weight wasn't coming off. In the last 2 years, doing the same amount of exercise, I've begun to lose it with two key products, and that is the Survival Shield, Nascent Iodine, and Super Male Vitality.
I look forward to waking up and taking my Super Male Vitality and getting the day started.
Take the challenge. For a limited time, we're combining both of the products together with a huge discount. Visit InfoWarsLife.com today. Again, that's InfoWarsLife.com. Join me, Alex Jones, in this journey.